A lot of backyard chicken keepers in America start out with one simple thought. Keeping a few hens for eggs must be cheaper than buying eggs at the grocery store. But after just a few months, they realize it is not that simple. Every trip to the farm store turns into another bag of feed, another sack of grain, oyster shell, mealworms, straw, coop bedding, and when winter comes, one more thing to worry about: keeping the flock warm. Each item may not look too expensive on its own, but over a full year, even a small backyard flock can turn into a real expense. That is why I started paying attention to the way some Amish families keep chickens. What surprised me was not that they had some special feed mix. It was that they did not let the flock depend completely on store-bought feed. For them, part of the chicken's food is already sitting in the kitchen scrap bucket, under the layer of old leaves in the garden, among clean weeds, in the insects scratching around in the soil, and in the crops grown during summer and saved for winter. So, is $1 a week really possible? Can a kitchen, a garden, a pasture, and a coop be turned into a near-closed-loop chicken system that helps you rely less on grain and stretch every bag of feed much further? Let's take a closer look. Kitchen scraps aren't always trash. The first source of feed is not out in the pasture. It is right there in the kitchen. Every week, many American families still throw away vegetable peels, leftover rice, extra oatmeal, stale bread, cooked pasta, slightly wilted greens, or a piece of sweet potato left from dinner. For a frugal chicken keeper, these things are not trash. When they are still clean and have not gone bad, they can become extra feed for the flock. But let's be clear, using kitchen scraps doesn't mean you can just feed your chickens anything. Do not use moldy, spoiled, rotten, overly salty, greasy, sugary, dirty food, chocolate, or anything that already smells off. An average laying hen can eat around 1/4 pound of feed a day, so leftovers should only be a side help to stretch the feed bag, not a full replacement for a balanced ration. The simple way is to keep a separate bucket in the kitchen. Whenever you have leftover rice, clean vegetables, steamed squash, cooked sweet potato, oatmeal, or plain pasta that is not too salty, put it in that bucket and feed it to the chickens the same day. It is not a trash bucket. It is not a bucket for rotting scraps. It is a clean bucket for extra feed. When this habit repeats day after day, you do more than save money on chicken feed. You also stop throwing away food your flock can safely put to use. Protein and calcium don't always have to come from a feed bag. After kitchen scraps, the next thing to look at is protein and calcium. Many people see the words vegetarian fed on an egg carton and assume chickens only need grain and greens. But chickens are actually omnivores. When they are allowed to roam in a clean yard or pasture, they peck at grubs, chase bugs, pick up worms, nibble young grass, eat tender leaves, and go after almost anything small that moves under their feet. So if chickens are kept too long on bare ground with no grass, no bugs, no green leaves, and we only pour grain into the feeder, we are taking away part of their natural foraging instinct. But that does not mean feeding them spoiled meat, dead animals, or anything unsanitary. If you use protein from the kitchen, stick with small amounts that are cooked, clean, not moldy, not spoiled, not overly salty, and still safe to eat. For laying hens, the main ration should still be balanced, usually around 16 to 18% protein. Calcium matters just as much, because every egg pulls a lot of minerals from the hen's body to build the shell. Besides oyster shell, eggshells can also go back to the flock as an extra calcium source when they are handled the right way. Do not toss whole eggshells straight into the coop. Let the shells dry completely. Lightly bake them if needed, then crush them small so the hens do not recognize the original egg shape. This is a clear example of circular thinking. The hens lay the eggs, the family eats what is inside, and the cleaned, crushed shells go back to support the flock. Protein can come from pasture, bugs, and safe extra feed sources. Calcium can come from oyster shell or finely crushed eggshells. The goal is not to drop a balanced ration. The goal is to rely less on store-bought feed by using safer, more natural sources already around the homestead. Move the chickens off. One fixed spot. If you want to cut costs for real, do not just look at the feeder. Look out at the yard. Chickens were not made to stand forever on bare dirt. When they are kept in one place too long, they eat down the grass, scratch the ground bare, manure builds up. The smell gets stronger. Pests and disease problems show up more easily. And in the end, the keeper has to buy more feed, more bedding, and more things to fix the mess. A more practical way is to keep the chickens moving. Many people use a chicken tractor, which is simply a movable chicken coop. It does not need to be fancy. It just needs a light frame with wire, a roof for cover, enough protection from predators, and it should be easy to pull to a fresh spot. Depending on stocking density and grass quality, you can shift the tractor every day or every few days so the flock always has fresh ground to work through. On a fresh patch of grass, the chickens will find young shoots, tender leaves, grass seeds, bugs, and tiny things most people never notice. They peck, scratch, dig, eat part of their natural feed, and leave manure spread more evenly across the ground. When managed well, the ground behind them does not stay stripped for too long. It gets time to recover, while the flock becomes less dependent on bagged feed. That is the difference between simply keeping chickens in a coop and bringing chickens into a living soil system. A flock stuck in one place can quickly turn one corner of the yard into a dirty mess. But a flock rotated the right way can turn many small patches of yard into feed, fertilizer, and natural activity. Frugal chicken keeping is not just about finding cheaper feed. It is about redesigning the way your flock works with your land. Weeds and bugs are an overlooked feed source. Once you know how to rotate the flock, the next feed source is right under their feet: weeds and insects. Many things American gardeners usually pull out, like dandelion, plantain, lamb's quarters, young grass, tender leaves, and grass seeds, are actually green feed chickens love. But the rule is simple: only use plants from clean areas. Do not take weeds from roadsides. Do not use plants from places recently sprayed with herbicide or pesticide, and do not feed any unfamiliar plant unless you are sure it is safe. In a clean garden, handfuls of young weeds from the edges of the beds, older vegetable leaves, or freshly cut cover crops can become a side meal for the flock. This is not a way to replace feed completely. It is a way to add greens, give the chickens natural activity, and cut down on waste in the garden. Insects matter just as much. Chickens are omnivores, so when they have access to clean soil, they will scratch through old leaves, pick up grubs, catch bugs, hunt for worms, and keep pecking as they work the ground. That is a natural protein source, but it should not be turned into a dirty trick, like using dead fish, rotten meat, or animal carcasses to attract maggots. Those methods can bring disease risks into the flock. A safer way is to keep a patch of dry, rotting leaves at the edge of the garden, with no sprays used on it, or let the chickens into harvested garden beds for a controlled time, anywhere from about 30 minutes to a few hours, depending on the size of the area. They will eat leftover bugs, pick up weed seeds, lightly scratch the soil surface, and leave manure behind. A good system doesn't need to shock anyone. It just needs to be clean, sensible, and managed the right way. Fermented feed helps cut waste. After weeds and insects, another way to stretch feed is to ferment a portion of your dry grain or crumbles/mash. Many traditional chicken-keeping families call this sour feed. The simple method is to put just enough feed for a small batch into a clean bucket Add clean water until the feed is covered, and let it sit for about 2 to 4 days depending on the temperature. When done right, the mix should have a mild, pleasant sour smell, like sourdough bread or yogurt, not a rotten smell. This helps because damp feed is softer, chickens waste less by scratching it out of the feeder, and the fermentation process may support gut microbes and help the flock make better use of the feed. Fermented feed does not turn 1 bag of feed into 3 bags, and it does not replace a balanced ration. It is simply a way to cut waste and help each serving of feed get used more efficiently. The safety rule is to make small batches, only enough for 1 to 2 days of feeding. Use a clean bucket, clean water, stir with a clean tool, and check the smell every day. If you see green mold, black mold, strange slime, or smell rotten garbage, do not try to save it. Throw it out, wash the bucket well, and start over. Fermenting feed is a good tool, but it only works when it is kept clean and managed properly. Growing chicken feed in summer for winter use. In many U.S. states, winter means the grass stops growing, bugs disappear, and the flock has to lean harder on bagged feed. That is why the smart move is to start preparing winter feed in spring and summer, while the garden still has plenty to offer. Some crops work especially well as extra feed for chickens, such as winter squash, pumpkin, butternut squash, sunflowers, mangle beets, or other storage roots that fit your local climate. Squash and pumpkins can be grown in the warm season, harvested near the end of the season, and stored in a dry, cool, well-ventilated place. In winter, you only need to split one open, and the chickens get extra flesh, seeds, moisture, and natural pecking activity. Sunflowers are also worth growing along a fence line or at the edge of the garden. By the end of the season, the dried flower heads can be cut and hung in the coop so the chickens can peck at them little by little. With large roots like mangle beets or other root crops, even a small bed can produce a surprising amount of extra feed if you store them properly. Set aside a small part of the garden for growing stored feed for the flock. When winter comes, squash, sunflowers, or storage roots can help the chickens depend less on store-bought feed. Milk, whey, and the habit of bartering in the community. Another extra feed source on traditional farms is milk and whey. If a family keeps a milk cow, dairy goats, or makes cheese at home, they often have extra milk, whey, or a little naturally fermented milk that can be put to use for the chickens. These can add some protein and energy, but for backyard chicken keepers in America, not everyone has a cow or goat behind the house. So I see this more as a lesson in making use of clean byproducts from another part of the homestead. If there is a small farm or cheesemaker near you, sometimes you can trade eggs, vegetables, or a bit of labor for clean whey. That kind of exchange is very practical in communities that still live close to agriculture. But this part needs common sense. I do not use spoiled milk. I do not leave milk sitting in the coop too long in hot weather. And I do not pour so much that the coop floor turns wet, sour, smelly, or starts drawing flies. Milk and whey should only be a small supplement in the right situations. The flock's main ration still needs to be balanced, clean, and steady. Keeping the coop warm by blocking wind and keeping it dry. Now, let's look at another winter expense: keeping the chicken coop warm. Many people think low temperature is the biggest problem, but for a healthy flock, drafts and moisture are often more dangerous. If the co-op stays dry, has no wind blowing straight onto the roosting area, and still has ventilation up high, chickens can handle cold weather much better. The real trouble comes when the coop is cold, damp, and drafty all at once. That is when the comb and wattles are more likely to get frostbite, and the flock's breathing can suffer too. So before thinking about a heat lamp, block the wind and keep the coop floor dry. Heat lamps can raise the electric bill, bring a fire risk, and leave you depending on outdoor wiring. One practical method is to stack straw bales around the outside of the coop especially on the side where the winter wind hits hardest. Straw helps create a natural windbreak, but that does not mean sealing the coop shut. Chickens still need ventilation near the roof so moisture and ammonia can escape. A good winter coop should have three things: no direct draft blowing onto the roosting area, a dry floor, and a way for damp air to leave from up high. If you use straw bales, check them regularly for mold, mice, and damp spots that stay wet too long. So, does it really cost just $1 a week? At this point, a lot of people may be asking, can chicken keeping like this really cost around $1 a week? My honest answer is this: it can be true for some systems, but it is not a promise for every backyard. If your flock lives in a small yard with no grass, no garden, no clean leftovers, no pasture, and a long winter that wipes out nearly every natural feed source, then yes, you will still depend pretty heavily on store-bought feed. But if the kitchen gives you clean scraps, the garden gives you weeds and extra greens, the pasture gives you bugs, summer gives you squash and sunflowers for winter, and the manure goes back into the soil, then each bag of feed can stretch a whole lot further. So instead of asking, is it exactly $1 or not? I think the better question is, how much money have I cut each week by using what my garden already has? The number will be different for every family, but the mindset is the same. The more natural feed sources you bring into the system, the less your flock has to depend on bagged feed. What I like about the way many Amish families do things is that they do not make one piece carry the whole system. They look past the feed bag and pay attention to how the kitchen, the garden, the pasture, and the coop can back each other up. The kitchen adds clean scraps. The garden adds extra greens, clean weeds, and storage crops. The pasture adds bugs, young grass, and natural seeds. The chickens leave manure behind, and that goes back to feed the soil. When you look at it that way, frugal chicken keeping is no longer a handful of scattered tricks. It becomes a small circle where each part of the homestead does its share. Before buying another bag of feed, I would look around the garden and the kitchen first. There may be clean vegetable peels, stored squash, dried sunflower heads, ground eggshells, young grass, or compost waiting to be brought into the system the right way. When those small pieces work together, the flock depends less on bagged grain. The cost comes down more naturally, and the keeper stops chasing one short-term money-saving trick after another.